Hey, everybody from Zoomland. Uh, my name is Tim, and Anselm asked me to be here to talk about my books with you. And I believe, Anselm, you are using Making Breaking the Grid in your class.
All the time because it's a great example to show like the underlying grids that many people aren't really aware of. Once you point it out in this book, then they're like, aha, I see what you mean.
First section has been divided into three basic parts. First, understanding grids, where it talks about a basic kind of page structure, the basic kind of concepts and philosophies, goes through the different kinds of grids as it did before, column, then manuscript grid, or manuscript and column grid, modular grid, the hierarchic grid. And along the way, of course, there are, in addition to all the diagrams, there are real world examples with kind of in-depth text and explanation, compound grids. Some attention paid to image behavior that's new in the most recent editions, as well as text behavior, weird things that happen and how to address those with a grid, things like hanging indents or when you're using rules or bullets and so on. Wraparound text, more in depth on kind of flow lines and spatial zones, and then all kinds of other things. Second section, building the grid, talks about strategies for how to develop the grid based on an assessment of content. Um, and a kind of sketching process to get through there, how you're organizing your content and trying to think about different kind of levels in the hierarchy or different kind of page sequence relationships, and so on. Um, Designing to read, looking at text setting attributes as kind of the basis for determining kind of an optimal column width, and then how to extrapolate that into a more detailed column configuration. Throughout dealing with interactivity, column structure and row structure, um, spacing issues, dealing with a baseline grid, which is a total nightmare, that was lacking in the first edition as well, and that involves a lot of math, points and picas and so on. Different ways of thinking about how to develop a grid from image proportions rather than from text, depending on what kind of project you're looking at. Um, and so on. And then dealing with the grid in a responsive screen-based kind of environment, just thinking about how the resizing of the browser affects kind of the ordering of information across the grid as the browser contracts from device to device in different ways, and trying to maintain some continuity in terms of the overall kind of compositional idea, as might be developed first in print and then translating it to a kind of a screen, and so on. Talking about the idea of structure as an idea unto itself, as a kind of communication, as a metaphor, which can be quite interesting to think about. And then using it and thinking about sort of, once you've got the grid established, how is material articulating across the surface in different kinds of ways? What's the kind of the rhythm or vitality of the material in those spaces? Talking about ideas of system and violations within a grid-based structure, and then sequencing and pacing and dealing with different formats. And then there's the exhibits section, which rifles through a number of different kinds of projects, from posters to books, websites, and so on. A lot of these have stayed in the book, but there's been also a lot of updating, additional new works, and again, from designers and studios around the world. In the same way, the second chapter proceeds pretty much going through a variety, first the kind of historical context for sort of non-structural approaches, um, and how those are, let me just kind of back out again a little bit, how those are kind of integrated into a Western kind of context when we get into the 20th century, and different kinds of approaches from the different avant-gardes kind of conflict with each other. Um, and then, kind of much greater focus in the 20th century, Swiss international style, and so on, then postmodernism after that. And then this chapter is again also broken into three major parts: alternative architectures, different kinds of geometry, deconstruction, splicing of columns, deforming a grid structure, um, and so on. Different kinds of verbal deconstruction as well as kind of spatial deconstructions, dealing with symmetry in the center axis, which is an absolutely valid way of organizing material in a page space. Not one that I happen to like, but that's just me. Um, uh, Dealing with other kinds of structure that are not actually orthogonal, that is rotational and radial structures, networked structures, constellational structures, musical structure, um, and so on. And then kind of more kind of conceptual approaches that are a little bit more fluid, more kind of subjective, dealing with kind of more irregular kinds of formations that aren't particularly geometric in nature. And then there's all kinds of things like chance operation, and just going back to here, dealing with vernacularism and thinking about arranging things from a kind of a naive standpoint or relating them to existing kinds of visual tropes out in the environment as a way of thinking about how to organize material, whether that happens to be something that's referring, as here on the upper left, to a kind of a legal document or to a certain kind of print heritage or poster heritage. Or objects like sales receipts and so on. And then the last section in this part is dealing with kind of like the trying to find some ways of creating a sense of order and usability in a kind of a non-grid based environment that can be very, very challenging for people because it is so abstract and so kind of free form. Really kind of thinking about problem solving in terms of how to direct readers to navigate through content that is being presented in a very, very unorthodox kind of way. Um, Various kinds of strategies involving type and images, dealing with information design, particularly kind of graphs and charts, statistical data when the structures that you're using for layout are not, kind of grid-based and kind of working with tabular ideas that there are a lot of different ways to organize information. Um, that way, how to create a kind of a sense of systematizing when you're dealing with something that is kind of free form and irregular. And then again, dealing with interaction and breaking free from grid-based templates and trying to get a sense of something. If you're working with like Wix or Squarespace or some other kind of very heavily gridded template configurations, like there are a lot of ways to kind of fight that so it actually doesn't appear to be grid-based if that's what you're after. And especially if you're translating, if you've got like a hybrid publication that's working in print and then also has an online component, is trying to get those two things to kind of synergize in a way that makes sense. Again, pacing and sequencing, and then the exhibits that happen in this way. A lot of new work, especially from Africa, from Japan, and so on. Some of these are oldies but goodies, as they stand the test of time. A lot of much newer, fresher kind of work to look at as well.